Welcome to the fourth series of Understanding Islam. This is week 2, when we're going to look at the spread of Islam outside the Middle East. Now, last week we saw the way in which the military conquest of the first 120 years established an Islamic empire by force of arms from the Middle East, spreading as far as Spain, the North African coast, up as far as Azerbaijan and Armenia, down as far as the Sind. But the reality is that 85% of Muslims in the world today are not native Arabic speakers. Therefore, Islam has spread far and wide outside this core territory of the Middle East over the centuries. Today's task is to see, how did that happen? So I want to look at the concept of the spread of Islam in two ways. First of all, the spread of Islamic influence and Islamic rule, but secondly, the spread of conversion to Islam, because that's quite a different thing. Now, we know that it takes 400 to 500 years for the original heartlands of the Islamic Empire to become majority Muslim. Most of the people who lived in that territory at the rise of Islam were Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians. The Quran speaks of these people under the collective name of the Ahlulbayt, the people of the book, the people of the earlier revelation. And they have a special privileged place within the Islamic system, because those are the people who were the followers of earlier prophets, earlier revelations, and earlier way of life, a Sharia. 4 groups are mentioned in the Quran under the title Ahlulbayt. 2 of them are explicit. Those are the Jews and the Christians. 2 of them are a little harder to work out. Those are the Magians, and they're normally identified with the people, the Zoroastrians of Persia. You remember the coming of the Magi, the stargazers, the astronomers, the wise and learned ones of Persia, who were an earlier monotheistic tradition. And then the 4th group are called in the Quran the Sabaeans. And these are normally identified with the followers of John the Baptist, the prophet Yahya, who were the Mandeans of Iraq. So these 4 groups then are accorded the special privileged status of being Ahlulbayt according to the Quran. They have rights within the Islamic Empire. They have the right to continue in worship, in private but not in public. That means in their homes, in their synagogues and churches, but not in the streets. They have the right to pass on their faith to their children, but not to seek to make new converts. They have the right to keep their existing buildings and to repair them, but they don't have the right to build new ones. They can be the servants of Muslims, but they cannot have Muslim servants. They are to be protected by the Islamic army. In fact, the term Tsimi is used, the protected people, to speak about these 4 groups. But they are not allowed to be part of the army, because the army is an extension of the Islamic political nature of the empire. And instead they are to pay a special military tax called jizya, and this tax is to help support the army. They can be members of the administration, but they can't be members of the executive, because the rule of the empire is in the hands of the Muslims. Now, I would call this a kind of institutionalized second-class citizenship within the Islamic Empire. But we have to say very clearly from the beginning, historians would agree, much better to be a Jew or a Christian living under Muslim rule than to be a Muslim or a Jew living under the rule of Christendom in Europe. Interesting also just to remember that in the time of the Mughal Empire in India, Hindus were also accorded the status of people of the book, those who followed the Vedas. So these are the privileged citizens then of the Islamic Empire at the rise of Islam. So now we have to face the question, how did these people convert to Islam? Over what period? And what were the motivations? First of all, we must be clear that when we sometimes hear Islam was spread at the point of the sword, this is not true when we're talking about the faith of Islam. Of course, we've seen that the Islamic Empire does spread through military might, but conversion to Islam takes generations and indeed centuries afterwards. But the Quran is clear. There is no compulsion in the ways of Islam. You are not to be forced to convert. Now, if we think about the different types of Christians who were present under this new Islamic Empire, we can see that in North Africa there were Arians who did not teach the divinity of Jesus, and in Iraq there were Nestorians who did not emphasize the divinity, and therefore their conversion to Islam was, if you like, a shorter step than for some other Christian groups. Like, for example, in Egypt we have the Monophysites, who did stress the divinity, and in Byzantium and in Spain under Catholic Western Christianity, then we get both divinity and humanity being stressed together. And so therefore the conversion in these two territories is rather slower. And indeed we can see that there are significant numbers of Christians who have remained throughout the Muslim centuries in those lands. We can only just think of Egypt, for example, in which there are millions of Coptic Christians that remain today and have retained their Christianity throughout the Muslim centuries. It's very important then for us to remember that the history of rule under Islam has been characterized by plurality and by living together in relative freedom, relative peace and harmony. Christians, Jews and Muslims living under Muslim rule. What we're seeing in some places around the world today, attacks on Christian churches, Jews being expelled from some Muslim lands and being sent off to the state of Israel, these are aberrations of the modern period. This is not the way that it was throughout Islamic history. But if we look at the motivations then for conversion to Islam during this period, I think that we can see 5. First of all, and by far the most dominant, must be those people who come to a realization in faith that this is the way that God is calling them to the religion based on the Quran and the teaching of Prophet Muhammad. Secondly, there were those people who wanted to relieve themselves of the burden of paying this military tax, the jizya, although then they had to pay the Islamic taxes, the zakat, and that was not always going to be a better option. Thirdly, critically, if you were not a Muslim, you couldn't join the army. If you weren't in the army, you didn't get a share in the booty, the spoils of war, and therefore other people were getting richer and you by comparison were getting poorer. So there were some who would have converted simply to get a piece of the action at that time. Fourthly, if you were not a Muslim, you couldn't be part of the ruling executive. And so those who had real political ambitions and wanted to join the executive, they needed to become Muslims first. And then finally, there was a social progression attached to being a Muslim. You could marry into one of the leading families of the society, and obviously you couldn't do that if you were a Christian man. So we can see a whole variety of different pathways leading over a period of generations and centuries to the majority of the people in those Muslim heartlands becoming Muslims. Now, if we switch the focus for a moment and think about the spread of Islam, of Islamic influence, of Islamic rule, then we can see three vehicles here. The first and most important is the vehicle of trade, because the Arabs were trading long before the rise of Islam. They were trading with India, for example, from about 1500 years before the Common Era. And they were trading down the coast of East Africa. They were looking for gold, for ivory, for precious stones, and also there was a slave trade, so that Africans were taken into captivity. Zanzibar, for example, was a slave trading island, and from there they were taken on into the Arab lands. And that trade continued during the Islamic period. Now, we find that Islam is then confined to the seaboard, to the coastal regions of East Africa, and it doesn't really begin to penetrate inland until the 19th century. If we shift the focus then to China, there are two principal routes by which, through trade, Islamic influence came to China. First of all, there was the Great Silk Road that went all the way through Central Asia and up into China. Now, this had been travelled by Nestorian missionaries in the past, and then Muslim traders followed along that path, and they carried on into the 9th, 10th, 11th century, when we start to see then the conversion of Muslims in northern China through the influence of those traders. But there was also another route of trade to China, and that was by sea. And already in the 8th century, there are Muslim sea traders who are going from the Arab lands around India and then going on to China. So by the year 1000, we start to find mosques being built in seaports on the South China Sea, but already there are Muslim trading communities being founded there from about the 8th century onwards. And then finally, there's another route into the very northern parts of China where we find the Turkic people, and they are converted to Islam really in the 15th and 16th centuries. India becomes always a very important place if one is thinking about going to the Far East, because India becomes a staging point on the way. And so it was from India that Muslim traders went to Malaysia, to the Spice Islands, to Java, to Sumatra, and that trade was starting in the 8th century. And it goes on and really develops in the period from the 11th century onwards, and comes to its height probably in the 14th, 15th century, when we start to find significant groups of Muslims who are settled throughout those territories we would today call Indonesia and Malaysia, and they are then spreading Islam through their influence there. And the final place in which trade plays a very important role in the spread of Islam is in West Africa, because there were trade routes that crossed the Sahara and went to areas around Lake Chad, like Timbuktu, Mali, for example, and went down to Ghana. Ghana was a great place for gold, and therefore the trade routes for gold can be traced right down into Ghana, really from about the 9th century onwards, although people start to become Muslims a couple of hundred years later, mainly around the 11th, 12th century. So we can see the way in which trade has carried the message of Islam from West Africa, East Africa, India, and across into China and the Far East. The second way that I want to look at the spread of Islam is through invasion. If we think about India, for example, we know that Muslims were in India, north of the Indus, from around the year 711 onwards. But if we trace the history through the 11th up to the 16th century, we see wave after wave of Muslim invaders coming into India, and they are ruling various parts of the subcontinent. That reaches its peak during the Mughal Empire, and we're looking now from 1526 up until 1858. And the Mughal Empire was by far the longest lasting and also the most widespread of the Muslim empires in India. But the vast majority of people did not convert to Islam at this time. Although there was quite a significant conversion to Islam in India, it remains predominantly a non-Muslim land which is ruled by Muslim rulers. If we think about the Mongols are rising from Central Asia from 1219 onwards, and then they're coming down through to Baghdad, and they reach Baghdad by 1258. Now, the Mongols have a particular place in Islamic history because they are non-Muslim peoples who are converted to Islam by the people that they have conquered. So by the time that we get into the 13th, the 14th century, we find that the northern branch of the Mongols, the Tartars as we call them, sometimes in history they're called the Golden Horde, these people now are spreading their power and therefore their Islamic influence as far as the Urals and down to the Danube, from Siberia and down to the Black Sea. So we see an enormous expansion of Muslim influence and therefore the potential for conversion to Islam in this territory. Finally, let us look at the Ottoman Empire, which spreads as well in the 14th and 15th centuries up into Bosnia and Bulgaria. So we can see the spread of Ottoman rule coming up toward Eastern Europe in that way. And through these successive invasions in different places, Muslim rule spreads, Muslim influence spreads, and therefore the potential for people to convert to become Muslims. And we can see that that is quite a dramatic movement over centuries in a place like Indonesia, for example, where there are reckoned to be some 200 million Muslims today. The third stream that I want to look at is the stream of the Sufi missionary. You see, when people went to trade, how interested were they really in spreading the message of Islam? Sometimes we just find that there were trading stations where the people were mainly Muslims, but they didn't really penetrate much out from there. Now, when you think about Sufi missionaries who are going to spread the word of Islam, that is their primary motivation. And we can see them being very much engaged in the East, for example, in spreading the message of Islam through the Malay Peninsula and through the various islands of Indonesia. We can see them in West Africa, for example, where from the Mali Kingdom, which has its base at Timbuktu on the River Niger, and really collapses around the year 1600, we can see that Sufi missionaries are spreading out through the whole of Western Africa from that period onwards and are converting people to Islam. Now we see then another phenomena here, and that is the conversion from one form of Islam to another. So when the Sufi missionaries went to China or to parts of Indonesia, for example, were they converting people from nothing to Islam, or were they converting people who already were nominally Muslims, but they were, as it were, reawakening and enlivening their faith in the way of the Sufi or mystical path of Islam? We can see the opposite action taking place in West Africa, when we can see reform movements that are trying to purify Islam as they saw it, and to bring in an Islam which is not so influenced by African traditional ways. And so then we can see Sufi Muslims who are being brought to this more purified form of Islam under people like Uthman Dan Fodio, for example, and therefore we can talk about the 17th to the 19th century. We can think about the founding of the great Sultanate of Sokoto in northern Nigeria in the 19th century, and we can see that we have another dimension then, the spread of Sufism and therefore the spread in one direction, and then another wave coming in West Africa where people are being called from a Sufi following of Islam to a more puritanical, a more reformed form of Islam. Let's go back to the other meaning now of the spread of Islam and think about the reasons for people converting to Islam during this later period. We're really looking from the 13th century onwards, but often more from the 16th century onwards. Now you can see that by the time you get to the 13th century, then you have got a much more sophisticated, developed understanding of Islam than you have in the very early centuries, because you've got a theological development, a literary development, you have more of a mystical dimension to Islam, and so the Islam that is presented has more flexibility about it, has a richer depth and variety than the very early period of Islam during the first Muslim expansion. This richness then enables Islam to adapt to various communities and various different places when it encounters them. And so sometimes we see, for example, in a place like India, we have what we call multiple belonging. People are Muslim, but they also continue to follow some of their earlier practices too. It's also important to see the role of leaders here, group conversion. So the king, the chief, the leader of society changes and becomes a Muslim, and this then brings the people along with him. Either they follow him by their own choice, if the king is doing it, we should do it too, or he in effect converts the religion of his community through his own choice and his own conversion to Islam. So we need to think of group conversion as well as individual conversion. Now, the first generation who convert to Islam in any particular society are not really at home in that society. They don't know its languages, they don't know its culture. But subsequent generations, 1, 2, 3 generations later, they understand better how to convey the message of Islam to those people, because they now know the language and the culture and the natural religious disposition of the people. So sometimes we can see that conversion speeds up after 2, 3, 4 generations of Muslim influence in a particular place. Sometimes there were economic influences that came into the question of conversion. In East Bengal, for example, there were Muslim landlords who set up businesses there, and they were inclined to recruit Muslim workers. So obviously, if you wanted a job, it would be to your advantage if you were a Muslim. At times in history, we saw the Ottomans offering financial reward for people who converted to become Muslims. It's always very hard to come to any real quantities or to trace these patterns of conversion. Often the histories are not written at the time. They're written some generations later. And so legend, history, wanting to inflate our sense of importance, all these things come to influence the way in which these traditions are written and handed down to us. Sometimes there were miraculous events that are held to have spurred the people into mass embrace of Islam. These things are very difficult to come to accurate knowledge. A great deal of information again this week, and so I do recommend you to go to my website where you will find an article to go with this program, and you find there the dates, the people in much more detail. Remember also that if you've missed any of the earlier programs of Understanding Islam, they're all available on the on-demand section of the Ahlulbayt website. Join me next week when we're going to be looking at how did Greek science pass to the Muslim lands, pass through the Muslim lands, and eventually come back to influence the way that we developed in Europe. I look forward to seeing you then.